For more than half a century, the world has tried to solve African poverty with one powerful idea: money. Since the 1960s, over $1.2 trillion in foreign aid has flowed into the continent. That is more than the annual GDP of many major developed nations. The intention was noble: eliminate poverty, build schools, fund hospitals, and modernize economies. Yet the outcome tells a far more uncomfortable story. When large-scale aid began, only around 1 in 10 Africans lived in extreme poverty. By the 1990s, after decades of rising assistance, that number had climbed to nearly 2/3 of the population. Even today, despite some progress, poverty rates remain far higher than when the experiment began. The gap between Africa and the West has also widened. In the mid-20th century, the average European earned about 5 times more than the average African. Today, the difference is closer to 13 times. Over 600 million Africans still lack electricity, and hundreds of millions survive on only a few dollars per day. This raises a disturbing question. If aid was supposed to make Africa richer, why has the continent fallen further behind? Why the strategy looked perfect on paper? The belief in aid was not irrational. In fact, history seemed to prove it worked. After World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were destroyed, factories dismantled, and economies on the brink of collapse. The United States responded with the Marshall Plan, injecting the modern equivalent of over $160 billion into Western Europe. The results were spectacular. Within a decade, European incomes surged, industries revived, and political stability returned. For American policymakers, this was proof that large-scale financial support could rebuild nations. Encouraged by this success, the West applied the same formula to Africa. The continent was emerging from colonial rule with weak infrastructure, low literacy, and fragile economies. It was assumed that if money rebuilt Europe, it could rebuild Africa too. But what worked in Europe failed in Africa, and the reason lies in a factor economists now consider decisive: institutions. The institutional difference that changed everything. When Europe received Marshall Plan funding, it already had functioning states. Courts, tax systems, civil services, and regulatory agencies existed long before the war. Although damaged, they could efficiently channel money into productive investment. Many African states, however, entered independence with institutions designed not to serve citizens, but to extract wealth. Colonial administrations focused on resource extraction, not long-term development. After independence, many governments inherited weak legal systems and concentrated power among elites. This difference mattered enormously. Strong institutions transform money into growth. Weak institutions turn money into political fuel. How aid strengthened corruption instead of stopping it. In healthy democracies, governments rely on taxes. Citizens fund the state and expect services in return. If leaders fail, voters remove them. This creates accountability. Aid-dependent governments function differently. When a large share of national budgets comes from foreign donors rather than citizens, leaders become accountable to donors instead of voters. Domestic pressure weakens. This dynamic has had devastating consequences. Billions intended for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure have instead financed luxury lifestyles for political elites. Estimates suggest Africa loses around $30 billion every year to corruption, and a significant portion of aid has been misused or stolen. This is not simply wasted money. It actively preserves bad governance by insulating leaders from public pressure. When governments do not depend on taxpayers, they have little incentive to reform, undermining local business. Economic development rarely starts with governments. It begins with farmers, shopkeepers, and manufacturers building industries from the ground up. Foreign aid often disrupts this process. Donated goods compete directly with local producers. One striking example is the clothing industry. Massive shipments of second-hand clothes flooded African markets. While consumers gained cheap garments, domestic textile industries collapsed. In Ghana alone, most local textile factories shut down over 2 decades. Thousands of jobs vanished. Skills, supply chains, and industrial capacity disappeared with them. Across the continent, manufacturing has shrunk rather than grown, the opposite of what happens in successful development stories. Why successful countries did the opposite. Every modern success story, South Korea, Taiwan, China, followed a similar path. They built export-driven economies. By keeping currencies weak, their products remain cheap internationally, allowing factories to grow and workers to gain skills. Foreign aid disrupts this model. Large inflows of foreign money strengthen local currencies. This makes exports more expensive on world markets, reducing demand for domestic goods. Instead of becoming manufacturing hubs, aid-dependent economies become trapped in low productivity and dependency. Exports remain weak, industries struggle to compete, and growth stalls. When good intentions create economic dependence. Over time, many governments adapted to permanent aid flows. Instead of building tax systems and competitive industries, they learned to manage donor relationships. This created a dangerous form of stability, not economic stability, but political stability based on foreign funding. The incentive to reform weakened. Dependency became normalized. Rather than serving as a bridge to self-sufficiency, aid became a permanent financial crutch. Why so many aid projects fail? Even when aid targets infrastructure, results are often disappointing. Independent evaluations show that a majority of development projects fail to meet their goals or produce lasting impact. Health programs lose supplies to theft and mismanagement. Housing projects stall. Roads fall into disrepair. Disaster relief funds disappear into bureaucracy. Unlike private businesses, aid agencies face little competition and few consequences for failure. Funding is often based on intentions, not results. Without accountability, inefficiency becomes routine. The core mistake behind decades of policy. The greatest error was not generosity, but misdiagnosis. Poverty in Africa was treated primarily as a shortage of money. In reality, it is largely a shortage of effective institutions. Without strong legal systems, transparent governments, and competitive markets, money cannot generate lasting growth. It circulates through political systems rather than productive economies. Aid did not create these institutions. In many cases, it delayed their emergence. When aid still makes sense. None of this means aid is useless. In emergencies, famine, war, natural disasters, external support saves lives. Short-term humanitarian relief is essential. But long-term development requires something different. Accountable governments, strong property rights, independent courts, and thriving local businesses. These cannot be imported. They must be built internally. Rethinking the path forward. If Africa is to achieve lasting prosperity, the focus must fundamentally change. Instead of relying on endless financial transfers from abroad, the priority should be building strong institutions that enforce the rule of law, protect property rights, and limit corruption. Local entrepreneurs must be supported so growth comes from within rather than being imported. Trade and industrialization should be encouraged to create competitive industries and long-term jobs, while effective tax systems must connect governments directly to their citizens, restoring accountability and public trust. True development does not come from dependency on aid. It comes from empowerment, where nations generate their own wealth and control their own future. The uncomfortable conclusion. Foreign aid was launched with the best of intentions. But after 6 decades and over $1 trillion, the evidence is clear. As a long-term strategy, it has often weakened the very foundations required for growth. By distorting incentives, shielding bad governance, undermining local industry, and encouraging dependency, aid has unintentionally trapped parts of Africa in a cycle of stagnation. Real progress will not come from larger donations, but from deeper reform. Until governments are accountable to their people rather than foreign donors, the cycle will continue, and the world will keep asking the wrong question, not how much money Africa needs, but why so much money has failed to make it rich. And that's the uncomfortable truth about foreign aid in Africa. A story of good intentions, flawed assumptions, and consequences few expected. If you found this breakdown insightful, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives that challenge what we think we know about the world. Your support helps this channel grow, and I'll see you in the next video.